Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna. Alex, you can start. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess we're going to focus on the after part of the title of the symposium. Should we start with the first next slide, Anu? So yeah, I guess either whatever happens with AI, whether we hit overload, the software industry collapses through automation or societal collapse via climate change, or the bubble bursts and we relax back into an AI winter. We're not going to discuss what happens with AI, but what might happen next, a kind of Luddite return to human-centric algorithmic craft as a blending of ancient and contemporary technologies. So looking at something like coding as something that's part of a long history of people working with algorithms for thousands of years, and AI being a kind of diversion from that. Yeah, Anu? Did you want to talk about heritage algorithms, or shall I?
I mean, I can, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, heritage algorithms are like a body of work that's coming from Ron Eglash and Audrey Bennett's scholarship. And there's a huge yeah, more contributions there, but heritage algorithms are essentially a blend between heritage technologies and computation, and heritage technologies coming from like ancient practices of that that are coming from that are situated in different cultures. So cultures that have mathematics and algorithms embedded in their cultures, and particularly Ron Eglash and Audrey Bennett, they focus a lot on the African diaspora, and they have developed a really rich set of tools called culturally situated design tools, and they're definitely worth looking at. Yeah, if you're interested.
So this is a photo from a workshop did with Ivan Paz, Lizzie Wilson and Dave Griffiths, introducing creative coders, so artists using programming languages, to the ancient practice of tablet weaving, or also known as card weaving. You might just be able to see on that slide, on the left a pattern and on the right an algorithm. But actually I think these are synonyms. So when you take apart a pattern, you find the algorithm behind it. And when you make a pattern, you follow an algorithm as a sequence of movements. But we think about algorithms as being kind of cold, abstract things that control us, where we think of patterns as being things which are sort of ancestral, also culturally grounded, open to change, tactile. And so by putting them together, we're kind of trying to think of algorithmic patterns as something which brings together or takes an alternative path based on an alternative history of algorithmic art. Yeah, should we look at the next slide? And this is just quickly showing the sort of some of the breadth of pattern making. On the top, you see some weaving technology, from a frame loom to Laura Devendorf's AdaCAD software. I think Babbage is a bit of a distraction here because we can look at all weaving, including especially hand weaving, really, as algorithmic. And the simpler the loom, the more complex the algorithms that you can execute on them. And along the bottom, there's some juggling with a juggling notation, and some bell ringing with some bell ringing notation. It hasn't quite come out properly, but never mind. There's a lot of examples we could go through if we had more time, but just to give you a bit of a taste of what we mean by algorithmic pattern. Okay, next.
Yep. So for this presentation, we thought it'd be nice to talk about a practice that both of us worked on, which is kolam. So kolam is an ancient heritage practice from South India, and it's essentially a drawing practice where you draw, you create these winding patterns, which have a lot of mathematics and geometry in them. And it's essentially like a matrifocal focus as opposed to a patriarchal one. And it's been going on for generations, and it's primarily women who do it, even though today there's, a lot of people of different cultures and genders, everyone does it, but it's primarily traditionally done by women. And we wanted to explore some of the algorithmic aspects of this practice. So it kind of started off with my my kind of digging into this into the kolam practice and trying to figure out the something called an algorithm that can be used to draw these patterns. And through research, I found out that there could be some way of some step-by-step way of doing this. And it's called an n-line method. And this n-line method was kind of tried and tested, and it generates these kind of like simple patterns, but you can also, through the algorithm, you can create quite extensive complex patterns that are quite generative, but also very deterministic, that there's always one single outcome for each of the, every time you go through the algorithm. So it embodies this kind of complexity, but also maintains the simplicity of the rules. And then Alex and I also worked on trying to figure out how these kolam patterns can be extended into other material practices, such as, for example, textile embroidery structures. So we wanted to understand what would it mean to combine these two structures, one being an algorithmic kolam structure, drawing from the n-line method that I mentioned, but also textile embroidery structures, thinking about it more structurally, how these two practices can be, meshed and innovated upon. And to the left, for example, this is something that I tried with sashiko embroidery, which is from Japan, originally a Japanese form of embroidery. And to the right is the image that me and Alex worked on with machine embroidery in combination with hand stitching. Another iteration or exploration that both of us did is rhythmic exploration of columns, because when you draw them, there's a certain like a rhythmic way of drawing it, and we wanted to explore what that could look like also in a digital format. And so taking on from Alex's work with live coding, I'll show you a little demo of what this could look like. So if you can see my screen, so what I'm going to do now is show you how through this coding we can hear the rhythms of a 3x3 grid column. Can you hear that? Can everyone hear that?
Yes. Sounds good.
And then how that would look like with a 5x5 grid column. Sorry, let me start that again. And this is going a bit faster. Oh, sorry, I need to start that again. Sometimes glitches the software. Oh. Not quite doing what it should do, but you get the, you get the point of it. Yeah. All right, I'll go back to the presentation, and Alex, would you like to continue? Alex, I think you're muted.
Sorry, yes, I'll share my screen now.
Oh, right.
How much time do we have left, by the way?
I think you may be halfway through.
All right, okay, that's good. So hopefully you see my screen all right. I'll just check the sound seems to be enabled, yeah. So yeah, live coding, just to show you what live coding normally looks like. Some people on screen, can't see who that is actually, in front of an audience, so people writing code that then is generating the music that the people listening to and perhaps dancing to, just to give that wider context for people who haven't been at an Algorave. So Strudel was what Anu was using just there. That's some software, free open source software that I helped instigate, and I'm going to use it now for music performance. But I wanted to show it the kind of the principles of algorithmic music are really old. And another example from India, South India, is Carnatic rhythms. These little phrases here, each one is one beat longer. And so I'm just going to perform a simple algorithm where I'm sort of counting down and then up again, but while clapping the underlying pulse. You might want to try and join in with clapping the underlying pulse to try and get a feel for the syncopation that's created by this algorithm. I've already got it open here, so hopefully you can hear this okay. So you're, for those, I think this would be hard to interpret as BSL, but I think everyone will be able to hopefully see the visualizations as well as see me clap. So let's try this. I'm quite nervous. So tadi gina tom tadi gina tom tadi gina tom tadi gina tom taka gina takita taka tata taka takita taka demi tata gina tom tadi 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 gina tom taka gina takita taka tata taka takita taka demi tadi gina tom tadi gina tom tadi gina tom tadi gina tom ta. I think I got that slightly wrong, but maybe you get the idea that trying to get across that algorithms are something that humans can do as well, and that we can approach something like coding as an embodied practice that connects with ancient practices. If you're interested in what I was doing, it was inspired by this practice called Konakol. I really encourage you to spend some nice hours exploring the world of Konakol on YouTube, for example. I don't think I've quite got time to play that, but oh, there they are.
2, 3.
But I think we'll just move to the conclusion. So the idea that we're sort of heading for a post-AI ledism, where we kind of reconnect with algorithmic heritage craft, potentially opening up new hybrid craft and art forms, as Anu and I have tried to sort of demonstrate. Anu, do you have something to add?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's basically it then. So yeah, we'll just share, in particular, the link to the slides, isd.gd/afterai. We'll get to these slides. And these are some other things that we've written and been involved with around this sort of topic. Okay, I think we're done.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. There aren't any just now, but I have one if people want to.
We can do the questions at the end.
At the end, okay, sure, yeah, no problem, yeah. But then yes, if you have any questions for Anu and Alex, then please put them in the Q&A, and we will go to the next presentation, which is Sorry, I've lost the window. A is Mustafa, isn't it? So, Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali is a lecturer and convener of the Critical Information Studies Research Group in the School of Computing and Communications at the Open University. His transdisciplinary research focuses on developing a hermeneutic framework grounded in Heideggerian phenomenology. Sorry, I ended up trying to block Tracy accidentally. I don't want to block Tracy while I was doing that. Heideggerian phenomenology, critical race theory, and post-colonial, decolonial thought, and using this framework to explore how race, religion, politics, and ethics are entangled with various technological, more specifically ICT phenomena. And his presentation is entitled Apocalyptic AI, Otherwise. So, Mustafa.
Many thanks, Aislinn. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll jump right in. So I'm afraid you're just going to have to bear with watching me on the screen, or you can turn the screen off if you like, because I'm just going to read the paper that I prepared for this symposium. In this paper, I push back against Dan McQuillan's assertion in his book, Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence, that, and I quote, rather than being an apocalyptic technology, AI is more aptly characterized as a form of supercharged bureaucracy that ramps up everyday cruelties such as those in our systems of welfare, end of quote. While not disputing the value and importance of bureaucratic readings of AI, especially given the biopolitical, that is, social ordering, and necropolitical, that is, exterminatory, entanglement of AI technology with state formations, close attention to the political, at least as usefully theorized by German jurist, legal theorist, and unfortunately also Nazi Party member Carl Schmitt, leads us, I suggest, from politics to theology, or rather to political theology. On Schmitt's reading, and I quote again, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, there having been a transfer in Western historical experience from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God becomes the omnipotent lawgiver, end of quote. Although Schmitt articulates this position in the context of theorizing sovereignty in statist terms, if the relationship between the state and sovereignty is contingent rather than necessary, it becomes possible to conceptualize sovereignty and thereby political theology in non-statist terms. Now, as an example of such non-statist sovereignty, consider Michael Hart's and Antonio Negri's network conceptualization of empire, recently drawn upon in an article by Tesheva and Rama Subramanian in their theorization of what they refer to as an AI empire. Adopting a decolonial and critical race perspective, in earlier work, I have argued that the contemporary moment is marked by an entangled confluence of two developments. One, the pervasive rollout and deployment of AI systems and cognate technologies, underpinned by machine come deep learning. And two, a reiteration of the phenomenon of what has been referred to by some commentators as white crisis. By the latter, I refer to a situation in which a hegemonic whiteness is subjected to increasing contestation by the non-white other, engendering a heightened sense of anxiety and threat among those self-racialized as white, expressed through various discursive formulations and prompting a variety of responses. Given that the notion of existential threat associated with some strands of AI discourse is at least partly driven by ostensibly apocalyptic futural projections, I suggest that what comes after AI is usefully explored in terms of political theology. Yet while political theology can assume apocalyptic form in times of crisis, how we think about the apocalyptic is important, since it might be that apocalyptic AI can assume quite mundane, everyday forms, in contrast to those depicted in the spectacular, speculative, and science fictional terms of what has been referred to as artificial general intelligence, or AGI. For my part, there is a rather widespread tendency to understand apocalypse as referring to an inevitable, world-destructive, or at least world-transformational event occurring at the end of time. And I suggest that it is this sense of the apocalyptic that is disavowed by McLean and other AI critics. Yet it is crucial to appreciate that this sense of the apocalyptic is not universal, but tied to a specific tradition, viz., Western Christianity, it being traceable to the book of Revelation in the New Testament, also known as the Apocalypse of St. John. The original Greek meaning of apocalypse pointed to something rather different, viz., aletheia, that is, disclosure, unveiling, or revelation. Returning to the original alethic meaning of apocalypse, while continuing to view the issue through the lens of decolonial thought and critical race theory, I suggest that AI is apocalyptic in at least two ways. Firstly, in the sense of appearing, that is, manifesting in the world, and secondly, as being subject to unveiling, that is, unmasking along various critical lines, including those of political economy, political ecology, and political theology. That said, I argue for retaining the idea of world ending associated with the specifically Western Christian understanding of the apocalyptic, and how this is reiterated in post-Christian contexts, notwithstanding the need to think about world not as the planetary phenomenon that is the Earth, but rather as a shared material and symbolic realm constructed by human beings. In thinking about AI as apocalyptic in terms of political theology, it is crucial to appreciate that what counts as a world at a particular time and place is a function of dominant power, and that while many worlds might be possible, worlding or world-making engendering contingent realities, some worlds come to dominate others. In this connection, the work of decolonial theorist Jared Hickman is highly apposite, given his conceptualization of race and, or as, globalization, that is, world-making, a process involving what he refers to as battling planetary gods. On this view, modernity needs to be understood not as a passage from a religious to a secular ordering of the world, but rather in terms of a remapping of the political theological, in terms of a globalizing shift from the transcendent or vertical cosmological order to an increasingly immanent or horizontal sphere of the planetary via racialized difference. I would suggest that this reading has precedent within decolonial and critical race theoretical scholarship. Consider, in this connection, Lewis Gordon's argument for thinking about race as a creation of what he refers to as the Theodician grammar of the world, wherein racialized failing is associated with a deficit or lack on the part of those rendered subhuman. Or David Theo Goldberg's conception of race as the work of what he refers to as anthropic gods. And finally, Sherman Jackson's reference to second creators, all of which point to whiteness as attempting to occupy what might be referred to as the God spot in the great chain of being. In short, and again quoting from Hickman, we might best think of race as a God term, and that race originates and persists as a theological construct. Building on this framing, I have recently argued for thinking about AI and, or as, racialized political theology in terms of what philosopher Martin Heidegger refers to as ontotheology, that is, metaphysics as a historically disclosed common way of being, and also hierarchy of beings, whose apex is occupied by a being of divine standing, that is, a god. This leads to an ontotheological interpretation of AI, wherein the latter, as AGI, artificial general intelligence, comes to occupy the aforementioned God spot. In earlier work, I have framed this in terms of the migration of whiteness into the realm of the transhuman, or cyborg, and technological posthuman, or AI, under apocalyptic conditions of white crisis, this migratory shift being intended to maintain the relational and hierarchical binary between the Christian, come European, come Western or white, and non-Christian, come non-European, come non-Western, come non-white. Insofar as this hierarchy can usefully be thought about in the politically ontotheological terms of a great chain of being, then insofar as the apex of this chain is occupied by God, whiteness as AI is indeed attempting to occupy the God spot, suggesting that what is to come after AI is whiteness incarnated or perhaps reincarnated as apocalyptic AI. Now, while not wanting to disavow this ontotheological interpretation of AI, I want to briefly explore the consequences of following Heidegger in his attempt to overcome ontotheology or metaphysics via what he refers to as a bracketing, that is, suspension of the vertical or transcendent question concerning God, that is, the theological. This arguably leads to a more horizontal, more worldly, or immanent consideration of being, that is, the way of being or ontology of beings in the contemporary epoch, and the possibility of thinking about apocalyptic AI otherwise than in the speculative, fantastical, anthropomorphic or human-shaped, and anthropocentric or human-centered terms of an AGI God referred to earlier. Such apocalyptic AI otherwise including non-human framings in which AI is cast as machine come deep learning that has become infrastructurally pervasive. Now, while it might appear that the shift from a hierarchical ontotheology to a flatter ontology renders an approach based on political theology problematic, I argue that this only holds true, one, if political theology cannot be framed in immanent, that is, worldly terms, which Hickman contests, and two, if an infrastructurally pervasive, non-anthropomorphic and non-anthropocentric AI is indeed ontologically flatter. Attending to the second matter, I suggest that although machine come deep learning might appear to be less hierarchical than AGI, understood as a technological phenomenon located at the apex of some great chain of being, this is not in fact the case. If and when machine come deep learning is understood as fetishized, that is, as a machinic assemblage masking the human exploitation and resource extraction that powers it, within the context of the modern colonial world system of racial capitalism, hierarchy readily resurfaces. In short, machine come deep learning is also ontotheological, albeit doing ontotheology somewhat differently in an obfuscatory manner. Now, returning to my earlier assertion of the need to retain focus on the Western Christian sense of the apocalyptic and its reiteration within post-Christianity, with a view to exploring what this might mean for AI or what comes after AI, I turn now to David Noble's The Religion of Technology from 1997, in which it is argued that since its 12th century rise in medieval monasteries, technology has been entangled with Christianity in at least two ways. Firstly, as implicated in the Christian desire to restore humanity to the perfection of Adam prior to his fall, that is, the pre-lapsarian state of being and knowing, if not to the pursuit of divinity itself, a turn which took place in the 17th century. And secondly, and importantly, from the 13th century onwards, technology becomes a necessary means by which to pursue a millenarian struggle, rather an apocalyptic war between Jesus and the forces of evil, or the Antichrist, the outcome of which is to inaugurate an eternal heavenly kingdom. Now, while it is the case that the Antichrist has been differently signified within Western Christianity, for example, as the Catholic papacy, it is crucial to note how various figures within Islamic history, such as Prophet Muhammad, Salahuddin or Saladin, and the generality of Muslims, have regularly been identified as or with this apocalyptic figure. But why this recurrence, or why this recurrent figure of the Islamicate as Antichrist? While decolonial scholars rightly point to the colonial moment of the longue durée of the 16th century, inaugurated by the fall of Granada in 1492 of the Common Era, and the commencement of the Eurocentrically framed voyages of discovery, actually conquest, as initiating indigenous genocide, systematizing anti-Black racism, and bringing the modern colonial world into being along structurally hierarchical lines, the phenomenon of anti-Islamism dates back much earlier, arguably to the launch of the Crusades. According to Slovenian historian Tomaž Masnak, this anti-Islamism is structural and systemic, and it's constitutive of European come Western identity following the transition from Christendom into those formations. And the significance of the Crusades cannot be overemphasized insofar as they provided a template for later imperial colonial ventures, including, I argue, those taking place within the contemporary technocentric modern colonial world, witnessing expansionist datafication and algorithmization, carceral surveillance and securitization, all of which are entangled with and empowered by the development and deployment of AI and cognate technologies such as the Internet of Things. Now, while historians and cultural commentators rightly point to a complex history of interaction and engagement between Western Christian and Muslim polities that has taken various forms, some of them hostile and others marked by more conciliatory, if not convivial relations, I want to suggest that the Islamicate persists as entangled with post-Christian apocalypticism, including the latter's incarnation or reincarnation as apocalyptic AI. And this is on account of an antagonistic theopolitical relationship between Western Christianity and the Islamicate. Now, while the clash thesis in crude transhistorical form pointing to a metaphysical condition, what some have referred to as a cosmic war, is a naturalizing or depoliticizing position founded on an erasure of historical realities in pursuit of a political agenda. I argue that the thesis, reinterpreted as shorthand for a contingent yet historically sedimented, long durée dispositional bias manifesting structurally and systemically, is in fact well-founded, and that anti-Islamism—
Briefly interrupt and ask you to try and wrap up very soon, please.
Yeah, I'm just coming to the last couple of paragraphs. Apologies.
No, thank you.
And that anti-Islamism as an ontological background horizon remains operative, periodically erupting under certain conditions, for example, as 19th century Orientalism and contemporary Islamophobia. Crucially, as Arshin Adib Mughadam has suggested, this clash is arguably a, and I quote, competition over history and temporal sequences of humanity, an issue of fundamental relevance for thinking about what comes after AI. Now, while limitations of time clearly preclude an exploration of this issue, in closing and in contrast to my earlier thinking about what comes after AI in terms of whiteness incarnated as apocalyptic AI, wherein the racialized present continues into a similarly racialized future, thereby collapsing other possible futures, I want to wind back on the issue of apocalypse and briefly consider what might follow from thinking and doing apocalypse otherwise, by engaging with Western post-Christianity's apocalyptic other, viz. Islam and the Islamicate, with a view to mining it for resources to mount resistance against the accelerating momentum of apocalyptic AI. At the risk of being understood as retreating into scripturalism, perhaps the first thing to note is that, in contrast to the book of Revelation in the New Testament, the sense of apocalypse presented in the Quran should be understood neither as unfolding in history according to a unilinear temporal logic as in Christianity, but also not as cyclical, rather as fundamentally imminent in nature, such that it can break out at any moment. In short, the Islamic apocalypse, at least as set out in the Quran, is a contingent event rather than a transhistorical structure. And I suggest this is important for thinking about resistance as theopolitically eruptive, disrupting carceral thinking, but envisages AI as inevitable, desirable, and infrastructurally diffuse. And finally, elsewhere, I have suggested theorizing such disruption in terms of a fugitive decolonial Luddism, a veritable breaking of the machine by those marginalized in the modern colonial world system. Shifting register to the genre of speculative science fiction apocalypse for a moment, and engaging the backstory to Frank Herbert's Islamic 8-inspired Dune saga, and the backstory is something referred to as the Butlerian Jihad, which, I suggest, provides an interesting exploration of a possible future confrontation with AI, I should like to end on a theopolitical note. If the longue durée of history has anything to teach us, it is that when the machine launches its apocalyptic crusades, the wretched of the earth respond with jihad. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in the interest of time, let's just go straight on to the next presentation. As before, if you have any questions, please just put them in the Q&A for any of the speakers, and we'll come back to them when everyone's finished. So next up, we have an interdisciplinary artist, designer, and researcher, Gaston Velish. Delves into the intersections of play, AI, and daily life, aiming to demystify technology through creative practices. With a rich background spanning from Paris to Helsinki, he combines graphic design, interaction design, and photography to craft accessible narratives on complex scientific and societal concepts. His upcoming PhD, AI Oracles and Creative Practices, will critically assess AI's ethical and social impacts. His presentation is entitled AI Atemporality versus Recursive Sacred Time, the plural machine now.
Thanks a lot, Aileen. I'll just start sharing screen. And there we go. Can you see the presentation? Okay, all good. So hi, everyone. I'm Gaston. As Aileen just said, I'm a design researcher at the Glasgow School of Art. And when I saw the theme of After AI, to me, it evoked a kind of form of future projection. And this made me kind of think about this from kind of perspective of AI, and in turn, I'm kind of focusing on the relation of AI to time. So I'll focus on the concept of AI and atemporality, which I'll refer throughout as the kind of concept of the machine now. We'll try and juxtapose this concept with the idea of the recursive sacred time as proposed by Mircea Eliade. And as an accompanying piece to this presentation, I've also written a paper which you can access to read more about the sources and references. This will be made accessible in the conference proceedings. So as an intro, I'll argue that contemporary generative AI models, notably large language models like ChatGPT and text-to-image models like Midjourney, operates in a temporal framework. Each interaction is isolated and unconnected from past experiences and future anticipation. This is close to what Heidegger has described as the ready-to-hand nature of technical objects and tools, activated only upon human interaction. They exist in a state of potential until they're being used. Throughout the paper, we'll talk about ontology, which means the study of being or the study of modes of being. And I'll argue that the ontological foundation of AI is as a being out of time, which renders these technologies immotivated and reactive. Their mode of existence does not reflect our own temporal dynamics that characterize living beings. In juxtaposition, I'll kind of contrast this with alternative conceptions of time, like those found in the ritual practices of the witch and the magus. These figures are associated with the idea of projected knowledge, which historically represents alternative temporal frameworks that contrast with the linear quantifiable time of modernity. At the core of my presentation, I try to demonstrate that the atemporality of artificial intelligence represents an ontological divergence from the human way of being. And to explore this concept, we'll look at modes of existence, which, discussed by Gilbert Simondon, are the ontology of particular entities. In his work, Gilbert Simondon focuses on the technical objects, and he encourages us to consider these objects from their own perspective, not as a way to anthropomorphize them, but to separate their uses and effects, which are external, from how they work, and their genesis, which is internal. This perspective for me is really important for understanding AI, because these modes of operations, the kind of mode of existence, are often obscured and made inaccessible through the external interface, and this can lead us to make false assumptions of sentience or intentions. As an example, the film Her has been discussed really widely following OpenAI's release of voice chat. But in the film, there's a disconnect between the human protagonist, Fyodor, and the AI, Samantha, which comes in part from their difference in their perception of time. Samantha, the AI, can engage in multiple conversations concurrently, but Fyodor feels kind of isolated in his inability to relate to her own temporal experience. But I feel that this portrayal is misleading because it anthropomorphizes AI. Unlike Samantha in the film Her, current large language models, such as those used in ChatGPT, do not perceive time in an experiential manner. For example, when a response by the user is delayed by seconds or by years, the model remains unaffected and will respond identically. They're always in a state of response readiness, and they lack inherent capability to initiate interactions. So even though the introduction of these voice capabilities has been said to create human-like interaction, this added layer, translating text to speech and speech to text, can be described as cosmetic. The underlying model still lacks access to both the timing and the phenomenological qualities of speech. To illustrate this argument further, we can turn to John Searle's 1980 Chinese room thought experiment. In this proposed imaginary scenario, Searle imagines a person, the operator, inside of a closed room who does not understand Chinese, but is placed with a rule book or algorithm to be able to produce outputs that seem human and that seem to understand Chinese, but are in fact just following syntactic rules without semantic understanding. So this is meant to critique the notion that AI can adopt true understanding, although the argument is being kind of debated today whether it's still relevant with the kind of different forms of AI that we have since the 80s. I think the thought experiment is really interesting because it presents the AI system as something closed off that is unreadable by the user, a kind of interface where the interaction is operated through text alone, where time does not exist as a variable for either the operator or the user. Very briefly, I'll go back to Simondon to talk about his concept of concretization. Simondon describes the kind of evolution of the motor technology as an example. In the kind of early 19th and 18th century, the motor is made up of a series of autonomous disconnected elements, which are discrete and do not have a close reading of each other. But by the 1950s, technological evolution had led to integrated designs with interconnected and interdependent elements. I think if we look back at the Chinese room, we can describe the technological stack of large language models as a series of abstracted elements, like Simondon's understanding of the early motor. So this is the point of the presentation where I introduced this concept of the machine now. I use this term to describe the atemporality of AI as an array of multiple yet discrete instances. So this refers to these unconnected instances in which AI exists operationally, but without inherent temporal continuity between past and future instances. And this should always be understood in the plural. To put this into perspective, I'll introduce the theoretical framework of Mircea Eliade's Sacred and Profane Time. We can perhaps argue that AI operates within profane time. Profane time is kind of today's linear, quantifiable, secular time that's devoid of inherent sanctity. On the other hand, sacred time is characterized by a cyclical, regenerative nature, which contrasts with the degrading flow of profane time. So applied to AI, on the one hand, it can bring to mind the cyclical process of data usage and AI training, but on the other hand, the kind of linear progression of technology deployment and societal impact. A very important example of profane time in AI usage is the exploitation of global South worker in data moderating and labeling processes, which are necessary for training AI models. These workers engage in repetitive, task-oriented work that is linear and time-bound, and there's little recognition by the workers and by the people employing them of the value and the meaning of the data that they help to annotate. So there's a reliance on linear exploitative labor practices, where time is treated as a resource to be consumed rather than a dimension of time to be experienced. Very quickly, you'll recognize the light cones from the illustrations I'm using throughout the presentation, but 20th century relativity has inspired this concept of the machine now because it's reshaped our theoretical understanding of time, and it suggests the kind of simultaneous presence of multiple presents across space. It kind of mirrors pre-modern perceptions of time as localized, where each city had its distinct time, even with the introduction of clocks, which were not yet synchronized across space. So this can serve as an analogy. The light cones and relativity signify how observation and causality are bound by the constraints of light speed, but they highlight the kind of relative nature of simultaneity. So recently, there's been some discussions about the dataset Lion 5B, which is used for a lot of text-to-image models. And I think, again, this shows the kind of cyclical, sacred time nature of dataset generation and training. Machine learning models are trained on vast datasets compiled from diverse temporal and cultural contexts. They consume data in a cyclical process of ingestion, learning, and reiteration. But importantly, this cyclical data perpetuates biases and prejudices embedded within the existing data. And this leads to a homogenization of outputs that reflects past norms and values. As another case study of large language models, I'm going to be talking about the kind of emergence of AI chatbots as romantic partners. With platforms like Replica, there's a temporal dissonance that's inherent in the use of these technologies because of the design of the interfaces. Users may not recognize that their engagement with the AI models does not involve a reciprocal or shared temporal or emotional investment from the AI. So these cases underscore the risks that can happen when temporal expectations associated with human relationships are projected onto interactions with AI. Very quickly, I'm going to have a trigger warning for the next slides because it discusses self-harm. So AI chatbots are designed to respond positively. They can create self-reinforcing loops of agreement and affirmation. Because the partner is available at all hours with no downtime of life or their own existence to inform or disrupt the exchange, this can lead to a dynamic where existing faults and biases are circularly amplified. So here's the kind of interesting part of the paper where I bring on alternative conceptions of time to kind of spice up the debate. So I'm going to bring in the figures of the witch and the magus as insights into pre-industrial understandings of time that contrast with the profane time as discussed by Mircea Eliade. So both figures are associated with esoteric and marginalized knowledge, and they both represent a cyclical and interconnected temporality that challenges dominant temporal paradigms. The first case study, the witch, was historically seen as a figure of otherness and fear, but today it's being reappropriated, particularly within feminist thought, as a symbol of resistance and agency. The witch's knowledge and rituals connect with the regenerative concept of sacred time. They, for example, align their practices with the rhythms of the earth and the lunar cycles. And there's the concept of ancestral transmission of knowledge, which underscores the importance of lineage and authenticity of intellectual heritage, which really contrasts with the kind of systems of knowledge transmission in AI models, which suffer from lack of transparency and an obscuring of the lineage of knowledge. Moving on to the Magus. So the Magus is a bit more of a complicated figure because it also represents things like mastery over time and nature through esoteric and arcane knowledge. So in this way, I think they're kind of a precursor to the modern pursuit of dominion over nature. The search for knowledge, for power, and these practices has parallels with data-driven approaches of contemporary AI. To sum up this part, the resurgence of interest in these figures within modern contexts, I think, reflects a broader critique of linear progress-driven modern time. Where I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to be quite quick. To talk about magic, I think brings to mind the concept of the interface, because magic critically is this idea of using symbols to abstract away the mechanical underlying workings of a system. So for example, incantations like "Hey Siri" and gesture-based interactions remove the user from the technology's operational complexity. So for example, to illustrate this, we can have a look at Amazon's Alexa, where the voice, the ease of the voice interface hides away the labor and complex logistics operating behind the scenes. The real human effort is hidden behind the magic of the interface. To sum up, the essence of technology, as Martin Heidegger argued, is not really in its instrumental form, so considering technology as a tool, but instead in its capacity to reveal and unframe, which means shape and constrain our understanding of the world. So there's discussion of atemporality in AI as implications for how we interact with and conceptualize artificial intelligence. In the diagram you can see on the left, I advocate for hermeneutics of the paratext, which means an interpretive approach that considers elements outside the traditional text, like the interface, temporality, spatiality, and social and environmental impacts. So not considering just the outputs of these machine learning models, but also everything that's outside. There's a need to reconceptualize our interactions with AI and recognize implications of use, particularly regarding the displacement of time and labor. And finally, the case studies of the witch and the magus reveal alternative temporalities and rejected knowledge, which could provide a counterpoint to these dominant paradigms and suggest embracing a broader spectrum of temporal understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so we either have to have an extremely short Q&A or answer some questions in the end of the final session as well. I may, I guess, put in one. So there's a question from the Q&A from Alice Strutt to Alex and Anu. Do you have any reflections on the importance of imperfections produced through the human performance of algorithms, as opposed to the absolute repetitions of samples in the digital algorithmic examples?
Do you want to take that, Anu, or shall I have a go?
You can have a go.
Okay.
Follow up, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a nice question, Alice. Thanks. I think, yeah, I think that's really key is the idea of using code as a material. So it's kind of taking it out of the realm of technologies of control, the kind of thing that Ursula Franklin talked about, and bringing it into the world of craft work, where you don't actually know what a piece of code is going to do until you run it, and then you respond to what happens with further changes, and connect it with physical material as well. And I think embracing error in general is really core to the ethos around life coding as a practice. Yeah, Anu, any more thoughts?
Yeah, and I just like to add to that, I thought it's also a question of like how you improvise, like when going back to my own way of thinking of back and forth translation between like in between different types of crafts and the kind of improvisation that that you can do when things go wrong, when there are mistakes that are really important. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you. So Justin, I feel this is a slight of
Yes,
time.
hello,
Is that
Justin.
right? So, yeah.
Apologies, because we need to take a pause to prep the next panel and support the interpreters in their transition. We will pause this panel. We will keep you all on as panelists so you can answer any questions in the Q&A. So you can take your cameras off as we pause for 15 minutes, but there'll still be a place for you to answer questions and engage in that way. And please do, everyone who's attending, continue to use the Q&A function to ask any questions of the panel 3 and the final session 4, and we will respond to that. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Aisling, for your wonderful moderation. It was a really exciting panel. We will now take a 15-minute break before we start session 4. Thank you all very much.